Hello, it's Ernesto. I'm a film composer and I make these videos to document my career as one, so if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, consider subscribing. So, the last video that I put out was all about my very first scoring session. I just scored a short film. There was some string parts that I wanted played by live musicians, and so we were able to pull off having a scoring session with live string players, and I learned a lot from that process. So if you haven't checked that video out, I'll put it in the description as well as the card up here. Go check it out, then watch this video because there are a lot of things that I learned from that scoring session. Mistakes, hopefully, that you don't make because I'm passing them on to you. So with that being said, let me tell you the 5 things that I learned from my very first scoring session. Tip number 1, make sure that your parts are prepared well. This seems like an obvious one. Obviously, you want to clarify everything to your players, what it is that you want, but there were some things that I was able to add in my parts that I feel like mitigated some questions up front from musicians. For me, this included multi-bar rests, double bar lines, measure numbers under every single measure, and musical directions being all clear and present on the page. This also includes not adding superfluous things that don't need to be there. For example, bowing marks. Especially if you're not a string player, you don't need to add any bowings. Let the players decide that in and of themselves. And besides, for a scoring session, no one's going to be watching the orchestra as they're watching the movie. So no one has to be in sync with their bowings or anything like that. So don't write that in. Let the players decide that as they're playing, because one person's bowing can be very different from another person's bowing. So just leave that alone. So some of the things that really helped out, the double bar lines, rehearsal marks don't make sense in a scoring session environment, recording environment when it's cue to cue, but I did treat double bar lines as rehearsal marks. So whenever there were important entrances or a field change or something, there was a double bar line. Then we were able to choose those double bars to start rehearsing at. Also, those double bars break up multi-bar rests for players. So I find that very helpful when, for example, there are 4 bars of rests for everybody, because in the DAW there are 4 bars of rest when that was exported into the notation software. So we can all just start at measure 5. Everyone can identify measure 5 very easily. If someone needs some help, for example, our cello player had trouble counting and coming in, so I said that I would emphasize every double bar line. Since he came in at a double bar, it mitigated all of that, and we were able to continue the session very smoothly after that. So I would definitely add in all of those things ahead of time so that you don't waste time when you're on a time crunch. Tip number 2, this is related to tuning. Make sure that everybody is tuned together to the tonality that you need. This was perhaps the biggest mistake I made, because there were so many things going on. We were trying to move fast, setting up microphones and stands and seating arrangements and getting all the parts printed and making sure everybody has the proper part. Getting out of there because there was a group coming into the hall that we were using. All of these things together scramble your brain a little bit if you're not prepared for them. When we were playing, one of the musicians asked, can the other violin player and I tune together so that we know how we're playing? And I said, yes, of course. What I didn't think about at the time was that they shouldn't tune to each other. They should instead tune to an A, 440 hertz, because there are other things going on in the cue other than just string players. There are synthesizers that are playing. When I put the audio files from the live recording into the session with all the other synthesizers, they were out of tune with each other. That, my friends, was a nightmare to fix in post. It was first incredibly frustrating on myself, because I just thought, how could I be so careless with this thing? I was able to mitigate so many other things. How did the tuning get away from me? So I implore you to just remember that everybody tunes to the same source, and so that source matches up with everything else that is not a live player. For example, synthesizers. Tip number 3, make sure that all of your MIDI is cleaned up before you get to the notation software. This was something that I brought up in the video where I showed off the recording session. There was some work that I needed to do fixing the timing because the performance in the DAW, that was the audio demo for the director to approve, once all that MIDI was exported and imported into my DAW, it all looked like an absolute mess. There were pedal markings on string parts, there were some notes that were stacked together, but one an 8th note off, one a 32nd note this way, one a 16th note that way. It's all madness, and if you've ever done that kind of thing, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Usually in the professional world, a composer will hand off the session to an assistant. The assistant's job is to clean up the MIDI so that when it gets to the orchestrator doesn't have to mess with all of that. The orchestrator can just focus on making sure that all of the notes go to the proper parts in sheet music form. So if you don't have an assistant like me, make sure you just remember to do that. That'll save you a lot of time just fixing parts instead of sending notes to where they need to be in the session. And since you're seeing it in the DAW and seeing just where everything needs to be, that'll clarify a lot before you get to the notation software. So do that. Tip number 4, clarify everything you mean in the recording session. So like I said, most of the information needed should be on the page. I spend a lot of time in front of school ensembles, and I feel very comfortable expressing the need for some musical shaping or addressing balance, things like that. So when we were recording the session, there were a couple times when I would address the players and ask for one thing louder, or ask a player to play this in a certain way, or change the style here, whatever it is. Now, I had the viola player who was very kind to do the session. The viola player, I guess, was a little confused on perhaps the quality of the chord. She had been playing G's on the viola for a little while, and then suddenly she moved to double stops. The double stops were because I only had one player per part, so divisi was out of the question. Only one player could play the parts. Well, the violin 1, violin 2 were playing the melody in octaves together. I had the viola and cello play double stops so that I could hear the entire chord. Now, since I know that the amount of players I have is very limited, each note is chosen carefully. There isn't a superfluous note in any of the chords. They're all equally important. She had been playing G's for a little while, and suddenly she had these double stops where she added a C above that G. And she asked me, she said, "Did you mean to write these C's in?" And I said, yes. Those C's are actually very important to the quality of the chord. And I left it at that. I addressed another thing, I think, with the bass. And I saw her lean into her music and write something on it. Later on, when I was mixing, I noticed that the chord quality was wrong. It didn't sound the way that it needed to. I discovered that she removed the G in her part and just didn't play the G. She only played the C. Now, a G and a C double stop is an interval of a fourth. As far as I know, it's a very doable double stop on a viola. So I should have clarified that both notes were very important and that we needed to hear both notes equally, not just one note, because I said it that way. So make sure that when you say something, that somebody else doesn't take it in a different way. Hopefully there aren't other misunderstandings that happen for you, but this was just a slight misunderstanding between her and I. So yeah, clarify everything you mean. So this takes us to our last tip, tip number 5, which is pick up the player's music afterwards. This is something that I've heard people who know John Williams do. John Williams says that to any composer who wants to get better, after a session, go to the music stands that the players leave behind after the session is over and notice what they wrote in, because this will tell you where your shortcomings are. Whether it's players figuring out where to breathe together or percussionists giving parts to each other because of an impossible instrument change or something. All of these things will reveal to you what you miscalculated or what you didn't consider when you were putting the parts together. This in turn will make you a better orchestrator and arranger in general, because you'll think more like a musician, and especially if it's an instrument that is very foreign to you. For example, I'm primarily a percussionist, so I don't need to breathe when I play my instruments. Sometimes that might be an afterthought, I'll admit. So there can almost always be something that you learn from what a musician penciled in. Regarding the last tip where I said to clarify everything you mean, the reason I discovered that the viola player had removed the G from her playing was because I picked up the music afterwards and saw what everyone had written in. And she had crossed out the G's, and that confirmed to me my suspicions that I wasn't hearing the entire chord as it needed to be. That G was very important. It was the suspension in the chord which gave it its quality. The C was the 7th chord. So both very important color tones. This also reminds me of another thing that I heard the great orchestrator Conrad Pope say, which is, yes, you can learn a lot from a scoring session to discover your shortcomings as an orchestrator, for example, but don't let a bad performance get in the way of that. Make sure that the performance is good first, and then you can learn from there, because even something that's orchestrated well, played poorly, will just sound bad. So you'll think it's you, sometimes that isn't, I promise. As for the missing G, I was able to snip out the portion where she was playing the G's prolongated before, put that in the mix, so it wasn't the end of the world. I was able to at least add it back in a little bit. So those are all of my tips. I learned a lot from the recording session. Like I said, if you haven't seen that video, go check it out. It'll be in the description. If you have any more tips that you've learned or would like to pass on, please put them in the comments so that me and everyone else watching the video can learn from it as well. I'm sure everyone could benefit from everyone else's experience. So until next time, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Ernesto Composer, and you can visit my website at ernestocomposer.com. Thanks so very much for watching, and as always, take care.